I'm Patrick Emerton. I'm a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Law at Monash and an associate of the Castan Centre. And it's my pleasure to be chairing this evening. Three excellent speakers. We have Deborah Glass, Victorian Ombudsman, and two of my colleagues, Associate Professor Bronwyn Naylor and Associate Professor Gideon Bolts. I'll give them full introductions before their talks. The topic this evening is on prisons, in particular overcrowding in prisons and the human rights issues that raises. And also, before I introduce Deborah as our first speaker, I'll say there are some copies here of the discussion paper on her investigation into Victorian prisons. There's not enough to go around, unfortunately, so I can't just circulate them, but those who are interested after the...
On the website, anybody who this is out.
There you go, so hard copies here after the talk for those who are interested, and soft copies on the Ombudsman website. So our speakers will be going in the order in which they're seated, from closest to me to furthest. And I'll introduce Deborah first. So Deborah Glass is the Victorian Ombudsman. So she's recently stepped down as Deputy Chair of the Independent Police Complaints Commission of England and Wales, having completed a 10-year term there. And she was also held the same office for London, responsible for many high-profile criminal and misconduct investigations. Raised in Melbourne and a graduate of Monash University, which we are very proud of. She practiced as a lawyer in Melbourne before joining Citicorp Investment Bank in Switzerland in 1985. She was appointed to the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission at its inception in 1989, where eventually she became Senior Director. Upon moving to London in 1998, she was Chief Executive of the Investment Management Regulatory Organisation, which was a self-regulatory body being merged into the Financial Services Authority until the completion of that merger in 2000. That's when she was then appointed to the UK Police Complaints Authority, and in 2004 became a Commissioner of the then newly constituted Independent Police Complaints Commission. And Deborah was awarded an OBE for services to that commission in 2012. So it's with great pleasure that I call upon her to be our first speaker.
Thank you very much, and for the opportunity to the Castan Centre to speak a week after releasing this discussion paper on the rehabilitation and reintegration of prisoners in Victoria. What I'd like to cover this evening, briefly, is some historical context around the role of the Ombudsman in looking at prisoner complaints and prisoner issues. A bit about sort of current complaint issues, and then I want to talk about the discussion paper and the sort of issues that we've identified in it. So, a bit of historical context. These look as if they are about 100 years old, these reports, I know, but actually the Ombudsman's office goes back to 73. And despite the rather antiquated text, this is, I've got some direct quotes for you from Sir John Dillon, the first Victorian Ombudsman, who in his very first annual report 40 years ago said, and I quote, "I was surprised at the large number of complaints which I received from prisoners." We are not surprised, but 5 years later, in his one of his annual reports, he reported on a number of things that his office was doing around prisoners, and you do think that we have gone back about 100 years with some of these things. He said, for example, some of the changes made as a direct result of the involvement of the Ombudsman: "The practice of stripping prisoners placed in observation cells of their clothing is no longer permitted." We're talking 1978. In H Division, breaking rocks. "This form of labour is now abolished." What century are we talking about? And even more remarkably, beds in H Division. And I'm directly quoting from his report. "Beds are now provided." So, there we go. And I did have to laugh at this one, because there's another reference in here to general conditions. "The department has introduced many amenities. Prisoners are now permitted to smoke in the cells and yards, to shower each day." So, of course, we're going backwards to some extent, because, of course, now prisoners aren't able to smoke at all, and all prisons are becoming smoke-free, which has become a bit stressful for some people. But there we are. But I put that up just to give you a sense that prisoners have always been a very important part of the Ombudsman's jurisdiction. And I think, that there are some early wins there that have made it, have made that role all the more significant. And I think probably fair to say that the involvement of the Victorian Ombudsman has had a real impact on the treatment of prisoners in this state. Breaking up rocks. Now, the next sort of key area that I wanted to touch on, 2006, a couple of key things happened. One of them, of course, was the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. Now, what that did, in addition to bringing in a very important piece of legislation, was actually give the Ombudsman a jurisdiction over human rights. And interestingly, I am the only body in Victoria that actually has the power to investigate human rights breaches. This is not given to the Equality Human Rights Commissioner. So, there is a function in my Act to investigate human rights breaches, which has a direct impact on looking at closed environments. And the other impact of 2006, which is probably rather less well known, is the introduction of a free call line to the Ombudsman's office in all Victorian prisons. So prisoners can contact my office, it's not monitored, not recorded, and it's free. So it actually provides real access to people in closed environments who have complaints. Again, just finishing off the historical context, going to be brief. My office has carried out lots of investigations into prisons, and my predecessor, George Brower, was responsible for a number of very significant ones, and these are just some sort of highlights of some of the things that he did. He's looked into conditions in custody, prisoner access to health care, human rights considerations, lost property, death of Carl Williams in Bronwyn prison, youth justice, quite a few. And he said in his last annual report that conditions for and treatment of people in closed environments was one of the top 5 consistent themes during his 10-year term. And during his period in office, he conducted 6 major investigations into various aspects of prison life. So I am continuing in what is a tradition for the Ombudsman, in fact, looking at what goes on in prisons. So bringing us into 2014, this is a direct snapshot from my latest annual report, which simply gives you some overall numbers around the justice portfolio. And justice continues to be the most complained about portfolio that we look at. And you can see over 4,200 complaints in the last year, 75% of those related to prisons. And just by way of comparison, the next 2 areas that come after that, quite some way behind, civic compliance and the Sheriff's Office, which together amount to 12%. So it continues to be a much complained about aspect of the system, and it's not surprising that I'm going to look at it in the first of the own motions that I'm chosen to look at. So in launching this latest investigation, as I said, I'm continuing in a tradition. And here is a bit of background relating directly to the theme we're talking about today, of overcrowding. And what you can see from this chart, and it's the rise that you're seeing here is relatively shallow until 2012. And what you're seeing then is that it becomes much steeper, and the pale bar at the end is in fact the Corrections Victoria's own projection of where prisoner numbers are going to be in June of next year. That's what they're planning for. So background, obvious growth in prisoner numbers, which is clearly straining prison resources. In his last annual report, my predecessor referred to the increase in the number of prisoners held in police cells. There were in fact at times over 300 prisoners being held in police cells, where the agreement was a maximum of 100. We became aware of shipping containers being used for accommodation, and numbers of cases where prisoners weren't able to access programs, particularly the sex offenders program at Hopkins Prison in Ararat. So, what's causing it? Well, there are a number of reasons for it, but clearly the significant impact has been the result of the parole reforms and more recently sentencing. And I'll touch on that again in a moment. The response to this, however, from the system is to build more prisons and to increase bed space. So what we've seen is a massive building program, new prisons, and programs, in fact, just about all Victorian prisons have programs to increase capacity. And what's pretty clear from this, and perhaps not altogether surprising, is that when systems come under strain, people focus on the bricks and mortar, they focus on the beds, they focus on security. And what doesn't materialise quite so quickly are the programs and services that sit along with that. So when I was thinking, number one source of complaints to my office, what hasn't the office looked at before? I thought rehabilitation, programs, services. What is the state actually doing to make it less likely to go back to prison? What is the state doing to focus on how we can reduce the numbers through smarter means? Because actually, if you look at reoffending rates, that's more than 1 in 2. If you can tackle reoffending, you're going to tackle this. So what does overcrowding mean? And it's a critical issue of community safety. It is about, it's about safety, it's about cost, it's about the cost to the system, it's the cost to victims of crime, it's the cost to not only to prisoners and their families, but to everybody. So it felt like something that we should look at. And that sets out broadly the terms of reference of the current investigation, essentially around the effectiveness of those rehabilitation and transitional services for prisoners. And you can't do these things without looking at what goes on pre and post release. What are the transitional services? What happens after somebody leaves the prison gates? And I'm particularly mindful that when systems are under stress, as the prison system is, that women and Indigenous prisoners tend to have a disproportionate share of that strain. So I wanted to look particularly at, was that right, and are there particular issues affecting women and Indigenous prisoners within the prison population? So that's a sense of the scope of it, the terms of reference. And clearly what I'm not looking at, and I can't look at, things that are outside my jurisdiction. I can't look at the role of judges. I can't look at the sentencing of the courts. I can comment on these things, but I can't investigate them. And clearly, ministerial policy and decision-making around law and order is, strictly speaking, not within my jurisdiction. But the impact of these things, the consequences of them, is something that clearly will speak for themselves and are something that I will reflect on. So what have we done? I started this around the middle of the year. My thought at the time was that it would be a fairly contained piece of work. And I was very mindful of sort of parliamentary deadlines, because in my role, if you want to table a report, you've got rather limited opportunities to do that. Our hard-working parliament expired in the middle of October, and that meant that I knew that I had to actually get something out, get something ready by the end of September. I was going to actually table something. And it became pretty clear around the end of August that this was a really big job. And what I didn't want to do was rush it. We were getting a lot of people coming to us with submissions. People were responding. Prisoners were responding to us. The post coming to the office was significant. And I thought, well, actually, I don't want to. I'd like to explore this some more. So rather than try and get something out to meet some arbitrary deadline, around the parliamentary timetable, what I will release actually is an update and a discussion paper that pulls together, the issues from that we've discovered thus far, and puts them into some context to say, look, this is what I think the issues are. Is this right? Is this what you see the issues are? So that's the paper there are some copies of, and as I say, there are hard copies there, and it's on the website, and I would invite anybody to have a look at it. We've obviously visited numbers of prisons already, we've interviewed numbers of people, and this paper reflects the work done to date and the issues we've identified thus far. But broadly, what's the snapshot here? Well, what becomes pretty clear is that the issues are complex, and they're not just about the prison system. So what I'm putting up now is a sense of this is what we see in prisons. That we see that the majority of people in prisons are actually regular drug users, and there is a high percentage of people with drug and alcohol abuse and dependency problems in our prison system. and including families. Homelessness is a really serious issue around the prison population, particularly for women. Double the number of women than men are homeless on release. And that's a very, very serious social problem. And that's connected, I think, we believe, to gender violence, to not being able to go back to a place where they have been abused. Literacy, numeracy, education, big issue in the prison population, as you can see from these numbers. Huge difference between the prison population and the population as a whole around literacy, numeracy, completion of schooling. Mental health, also, really serious issue in the prison population, over 40%, 20 times greater than society as a whole. So when you're looking at the broader issues around rehabilitation and reoffending, this is the picture that we're looking at. And it's not just a picture that the correction system can solve. Reoffending, more than half. So what we're seeing is not only an increase in the prison population, but an increase in the number of people returning to prison. With the Indigenous population 13 times higher than the rate of the population as a whole, and a return within 2 years, 50%. Similarly, issues involving women prisoners, gender violence, particular problem. And all of that is a cost to society, significant. So people talk about the cost of programs. Well, what does it cost people in prison? It costs $270 a day. That's nearly $100,000 a year. And if you look at the average sentence, which is just over 3 years, that's over $300,000. So do something to reduce reoffending, and you will actually save the public purse quite a bit. So that leads me simply to what are the issues? Now, they're set out in the paper. I'm just going to touch on a few. I've not got answers to these issues. The point of releasing this paper is to say this is what we're seeing. But basically, starting with the whole issue, the problems of overcrowding and prisoner numbers, we're seeing the higher incarceration, less parole. So what's happening? We're seeing an increase in the number of people who are going out on what they call straight release, which means that people are either not applying for parole or not getting it. And that's more than doubled. That means, in practical terms, that people are simply going out into the community without the monitoring supervision that goes with parole, and also without having necessarily done the programs, the offending behaviour programs that people need to do if they want to get parole. Now we need to dig into that some more, because what we don't know is whether people are simply not bothering to apply for parole, or whether they're simply unable to get it because they can't access the offending behaviour programs. We don't know, but that's one of the things that we're looking at. But in broad terms, what we know is that straight release is going up, parole is going down. What's the impact of that? What's the impact of that? What does this mean for the effectiveness of the prison system? Big questions. A series of issues just through the life cycle of a prisoner within the system. There are issues identified around assessment. When people come into prison, it's not compulsory to test people's literacy. Should it be? Case management. At the moment, prison officers are also case managers. Is this the best option? These are the questions we're asking. They may not be. I don't know. There are real questions that we're asking around the effectiveness of programs. How do we know programs are effective? What sort of testing is done? What works, what doesn't? There are two main types of programs. There are offending behaviour programs, and there are vocational programs, both incredibly relevant around rehabilitation. And post-release support, preparing for release, transitional services, what kind of support is in place to make it less likely people go back to their old ways. And homelessness around support. So, we know that that's a really important issue for prisons. It's an important issue for the population of the levels of access to social housing already. There's a massive waiting list, we know that. Particular issues as well, as I mentioned, around women Indigenous prisoners. So lots of issues. There's a paper full of them. I would encourage you to read it and join the debate. We've invited people to come to the end of the year, to 31st of December, to come back to us with any submissions and comments, observations. Are the issues right? Are we asking the right questions? If you think we're not, please say so. If you've got direct experience of these things, case studies, evidence that you'd like to share with us, please do that. And what we will be doing is looking at all of those submissions. I would anticipate that this is going to be a considerable project going into next year to analyse that. We may want to come back and interview people in response to that. But that's very much over to you. So I will be over to the next speaker at this point and welcome your questions either now or at the end. I think what's the plan? At the end.
Questions at the end. Before introducing the next speaker, I'll just correct an oversight in my general introduction. I failed to mention that the Castan Centre is tweeting this event, and anyone who is following along or also tweeting, the hashtag is #CCPrisons. Having announced that, I'll now introduce our next speaker. So my colleague, Associate Professor Bronwyn Naylor. So Bronwyn has her doctorate in criminology from Cambridge University and has been teaching, researching and publishing criminal law, corrections, regulation and criminal justice, and particularly gender issues in relation to those matters for over 20 years. She's the lead investigator on an ARC-funded project on human rights in prisons and other closed environments. She has presented papers and published articles on this research and is a contributor to and co-editor of the New Federation Press publication, Human Rights in Closed Environments. And on your chairs you will have seen flyers advertising the forthcoming launch for that book. So thank you, Bronwyn.
Patrick, and thank you for doing my promo for me. That's great. What I've got to do is get the PowerPoints up. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to be talking obviously about prisons and overcrowding, make some reference to rights issues in relation to prisons and overcrowding, and I will be skipping over some of the bits that Deborah and I have kind of overlap on, and she has more up-to-date data than I do. It's very disconcerting. Okay, so first of all, well, as we know, there's been a recent huge increase in the numbers of people in Victorian prisons. So noting here October figures that I took from Deborah's discussion paper. Currently around about 6,000, 6,000 odd prisoners. And we note that there has been and continues to be a substantial building program, lots of extensions of prisons, and also the proposal or the commissioning now of a new prison called Ravenhall, which, as I've noted, that's kind of an odd way to do the numbers, isn't it? But it started off with plans for 500 beds, then became 1,000 beds. They're now saying, well, actually we can fit in 1,300 beds, and this is not open yet. This is going to be opening in 2017. So looking at the increase, the significance of the increase, first of all, if we're looking at the period from 2004 to 2014, so 10 years, there's been a 70% increase in the prisoner population. But more importantly, I suppose, is to note that the main increase, half of that increase has been in the last 2 years. And if I just look at a couple of graphs here, this was a graph that appears in a Sentencing Advisory Council report on prisons, and only takes the figures up to 2012. But what I think is very interesting is to look at that earlier part, 2002, right through to say 2006, where we see the numbers are really quite level. They go up a little up and down a little bit, but it's pretty even. What we see then, of course, as we get up to 2011 and 12, is we see quite a significant increase. And then using my table, which is just that 1 year short of Deborah's table, she has her projection, we do see that figure 6,000 and a bit in 2014, which is really a significant jump. All the other years you see jumps of around 200 odd, and then suddenly it shoots up a lot higher, and it's projected to be a lot higher still. And as we've noted, prison accommodation has not kept up with that. We've noted that there are building plans, but that's where we get to the point that we have not only large numbers, but we have overcrowding. And I'd like to note that those are kind of two, in a sense, separate issues. So, some causes. Again, Deborah's noted some of the main causes. You're probably aware of those. Coming into prison, we have more people coming into prison, increased use of remand as distinct from bail. So whereas in the past most people would be released on bail, currently those figures are now creeping up to nearly a quarter of the prison population. Now 20% of the prison population is people who are unconvicted and unsentenced but are being held on remand. So looking at it another way, if we look at the figures for 2002 to 2012, so 10-year period, we find that the numbers of sentenced prisoners increased by 31% and the number of unsentenced prisoners increased by 72%. So that's a really significant component of the increase. Also, we have more people coming into prison because of increases in penalties, likely continuing increases as courts are being required to sentence either to custodial sentences rather than non-custodial sentences or to longer custodial sentences. More people are also coming into prison. It's not quite clear how that's affecting things at the moment, but the abolition of suspended sentences, which has taken place across a period of about a year, 18 months, is having and is likely to have a significant effect on the rate of imprisonment. And even the abolition of home detention back in 2012 was predicted to have an effect on the numbers of people who would ultimately get custodial sentences rather than non-custodial sentences. And at the other end we have, as Deborah's mentioned, the reduction in parole releases. And you'd be aware of that major review that took place last year. And as I've noted, in 1 year we found such a significant impact that we had 96% increase in refusals of parole within the last 12 months. So really significant, both prisoners coming in and prisoners not going out at the other end of the sentence. Now what I'd like to really emphasise here is that increased use of imprisonment and prison overcrowding are not inevitable. Crime rates are not clearly related. I'm not saying they're clearly not related, I'm saying it's not clear whether they're related or how they're related to imprisonment rates. So for example, just looking at this stage at Victorian figures, Victorian crime rates have fluctuated. There have been some increases overall. Currently, some specific crimes have also reduced. I've got some figures there. These are the figures released by Victoria Police in August, indicating that there has been an overall increase, but at the same time, what we're looking at is a crime rate which is still lower than what it was 10 years ago. Crimes against the person, assaults and so on have been on the increase, as we note. Homicide was on the decrease. So there's quite a sort of complex and sophisticated analysis needed to understand what crime rates are, but also to look at whether or not they have any relationship to what we saw was that really rapidly increasing graph or chart of the use of imprisonment. That's in relation to Victoria, without wishing to sort of blind you with too much science. Just a couple of graphs here, and I'll just explain it, and you can take it on trust, okay? So I'm just explaining what it kind of looks like. Some data from around the world. First of all, data looking at 3 countries, as an illustration, looking at 3 countries, Finland, Canada and the USA. The solid line is the line of people in prison and the dotted line is the rate of crime. And it's just to note that, starting from the same base figure, don't have to explain the maths at this point, starting from the same base figure, we find 3 completely different consequences or sort of sequences afterwards in terms of the imprisonment rate. So if you look at your prisoner rate in Finland, going down, use of imprisonment going down, crime rate going up and then stabilising. This is from the period of 1980 up to 2005. Canada, you find the crime rate and the prison rate pretty much the same. And the US, you find the crime rate going down and the prison rate skyrocketing in that particular period. So I don't want to draw conclusions from that about those countries. It's just to note that when people do this research, and a lot of people are doing this sort of research, they're saying it's really very unclear whether or not crime rates have any particular impact on imprisonment, which goes back to the point I was making previously. There's no inevitability about the increase in the use of imprisonment, and it's not driven by crime rates. Another kind of curious graph, which I thought was quite interesting, though, was an analysis of a number of countries. We've got the UK, Italy, Netherlands, Finland, France, Australia, Canada, a whole range of countries, looking at what change you can see in those countries when crime rates change. So they said if crime rates change, in which countries does the imprisonment rate change the same way, and in which countries does it change in the opposite direction? And so the ones we see, the first few that we see there, UK, Italy, Netherlands, New Zealand, Finland, they went in the opposite direction. So if the crime rate went up, the prison rate went down, and vice versa. And the other countries, as we see going through to Denmark, Germany and Japan at the other end, they tended to show the rate that one might assume, which would be when crime rates go up, prison rates go up. When prison rates come down, crime rates come down as well. So the relationship is unclear, and there's certainly no indication of any sort of causal relationship. So I think that's really important to be bearing in mind when we're looking at this whole issue of increasing prison numbers. So I think what we should say from this, what we can see from this, is that the decision to imprison people is a policy decision. It's a decision that's made for a number of reasons which are not related to increases in crime. So in Victoria, we could say, well, we should be looking at revisiting the issue of remand, trying to make sure that more people are getting bail. We want to reduce prison numbers. We should be going back to the issue of parole, as Deborah's also said, looking at strengthening parole, looking at how we can have better properly supervised parole, and we should be working on alternative punishments. For example, we've got a new-ish, 2012, community corrections order, a very sort of broad umbrella sort of sentence or disposition. There's a non-custodial disposition which may be able to be developed to provide a real option for courts that will be able, and the courts will then feel safer about not sentencing to prison and sentencing to use a community corrections order. Okay, so moving on to the human rights point. Patrick. Okay. So moving on to the issue of human rights then. So there are two issues here that I think raise rights issues. One is the huge increase in imprisonment as such, in Victoria and in many other countries, and also the overcrowding issues. Yeah, so they're kind of two separate but related issues. But we're going to focus tonight really on the consequences of overcrowding. But I begin by wanting to emphasise then that prisons in general are inherently harmful to people who are kept in the prisons, no matter whether the prison is comfortable and there's lots of space, no matter whether it's overcrowded, right? In either case, prisons are, by definition, I would argue, inappropriate and harmful. The international evidence is quite clear that people generally don't leave prison better than they entered. They're more likely to return, and they're more and more likely to return. The data in Victoria is showing, as we've noted, increased reoffending rates, increased recidivism rates, and indeed New South Wales research indicates that imprisonment is more likely to lead to reoffending than using a non-custodial sentence. Okay, so that we recognise that. It's still a question then as what as a society do we want to do in the way of punishment. So we need to make sure that we're using prisons if we need to use prisons, and in the cases where we do need them, we need to be using them as a last resort. So even if governments allocate billions of dollars to building new prisons, which they seem to be quite willing to do, that will not make prison a desirable correctional option. And the money could be better spent, as I'm sure many of you would be aware, could be better spent on dealing with issues that underlie criminal activities such as mental illness, such as acquired brain injuries, such as drug addiction, family dysfunction and so on. However, given that we do keep using prisons, it's clear that overcrowding itself gives rise to risks of all sorts of additional harms. I just note here, for example, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in 2013 noted the range of impacts and consequences that arise from overcrowding, with recognised problems including pressures on sanitation, on nutrition, challenges to physical health, spread of communicable diseases and so on, challenges to mental health issues, highly increased levels of violence, which is something that does arise quite quickly when you get overcrowding. You find that the levels of violence both between prisoners and also between prisoners and staff rapidly escalates, and internationally recognised increased risks of suicide, for example. And the most recent annual report by the UK Inspector of Prisons notes both the high levels of overcrowding in the UK prisons that he was inspecting, but also the significant increase in rates of suicide that he related to those issues of overcrowding, understaffing, and lack of safety. So what does the human rights perspective on prisons and prison overcrowding offer? And I would first of all just want to say that in the context of prisons, our human rights focus reorients the analysis. It tells us that we need to look at the person affected as a claimant not as a beggar. They're entitled to human rights. They're entitled to rights as humans. They don't need to ask for special consideration. But what does that actually mean when we look at overcrowded prison conditions? Australia is, of course, pretty backward when it comes to formal recognition of the usual internationally accepted human rights. We've ratified all the relevant treaties, but we have no national human rights legislation, no ways of enforcing any of the rights in those treaties. So what we might do is, to begin with, depending on how much time I've got, is to look at what's happened in the international forum. In the international context, where the same treaties that we've signed up to are in use and are, in some instances, capable of being enforced. So, treaties such as the ICCPR, the Convention Against Torture, Convention on the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and so on, we've all signed up to these. It's a question of what do they offer when we're looking at the rights and protections of people in prison. And some of the protections which are set up in all of those internationally accepted treaties are set up here: prohibition on cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, right to humane treatment, and so on. In the European context, where the European Convention can actually be litigated in front of the European Court of Human Rights, there have been a number of cases raising issues to do with prison conditions that arise out of overcrowding. So there are cases where overcrowded conditions, shared cells, lack of personal space, lack of privacy, poor toileting, sanitary arrangements, limited access to healthcare and rehabilitation have been regarded as cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, so have been identified as violating human rights. This has taken place also in the Canadian courts, for example, which have reached similar views on their related legislation. There's also this positive right to humane treatment, and that's been held to mean that in a closed environment, in a place of detention, there has to be respect for the dignity of the detained person to be guaranteed under the same conditions as for that of free people. And the Human Rights Committee and the European Court of Human Rights have pointed out that this is a right that governments are obliged to comply with irrespective of resourcing. They're not allowed to say, well, we just don't have the money. And that's obviously a pretty significant factor that any government is going to raise and any court will be very aware of when they're looking at the challenges of overcrowding. So we note here in this 2011 case, the European Court of Human Rights said lack of resources cannot, in principle, justify these awful prison conditions. So it's all very well to say that you can identify some rights are being violated. The next question is, what about a remedy? Is there a remedy? There needs to be a useful remedy. And a number of the cases before the European Court, for example, compensation may be awarded to the individual, damages may be awarded. The court will indicate that the government needs to do something, they need to move, they need to show what they're doing. When the cases come up subsequently years later, the courts say, well, we asked you last time to fix all those terrible conditions and you haven't yet, so we're really cross with you. It's not quite clear what more can be done in those situations. So the issue of remedy is always going to be quite challenging. And we would note that in many cases courts are also, certainly Victorian courts and courts in Australia that have looked at prison conditions, have been very reluctant to make a finding that would assume that governments will then actually apply resources. They feel that that will be breaches separation of powers and so on and so on. We can't tell government how to govern. So there's been quite a sort of resistance at that point. But I guess one of the most famous